We have our excellent staff support here, Terry with our technology, Al with his video equipment. The kitchen has provided the refreshments, so we're good to go. First day of autumn. This season is, sometimes call it the big dark. But not here at University House. We have brilliant minds, and we have illuminating ideas, and we have sparkling wit. And it's all here. And me, I am just going to try and color inside the lines with the picture part. Okay, let's go ahead and hear from Al.
Karen, do you want to set your one off?
Okay, go ahead, Al.
Thank you, Karen. The game goes global. The theater of war widens the world around and even into the stratosphere. Everyone is getting into the act. Saudi Arabia, India, North Korea, and, oh yes, Elon Musk. A new biography of Musk by Walter Isaacson reports that Musk personally thwarted a Ukrainian sortie against Russian ships in the Black Sea. Now, how is this possible? Some background. Russia's invasion of Ukraine last year came just as satellite internet service through SpaceX's Starlink system was becoming widely available. It was internet access for underserved places where Xfinity and Verizon and T-Mobile and others may not be available by cable, hence internet delivered by satellite. Anyone who can provide that to the underserved deserves to be a billionaire, right? At first, access to this new means of communication seemed like a godsend to Ukraine. The terminals were relatively small, relatively secure, and easily set up in forward areas without a lot of infrastructure. With Russia regularly bombing Ukraine's electrical grid and frequently targeting communications hubs, Starlink offered a way for Ukraine's civilian and military agencies to stay in contact even when towers and lines were in rubble. But SpaceX now had a choke point on Ukrainian communications. All of this culminated in Musk single-handedly deciding to prevent Ukraine from striking warships off the Crimean coast. Or is that the whole story? Russia currently has a fleet of nearly 50 warships in the Black Sea. Those ships have frequently served as missile platforms for launching attacks on Ukrainian cities. They've also been used to stop commercial traffic on the Black Sea or to threaten ships hauling grain from Ukrainian ports. According to Isaacson's book, Musk explicitly ordered engineers to turn off his company's Starlink satellite communications network near the Crimean coast last year to disrupt a Ukrainian sneak attack on the Russian naval fleet. That left the sea drones, which had already been sent on their way toward Russian ships, drifting without targets, out of control. They reportedly lost connectivity and washed ashore harmlessly. In other words, Musk intervened in a battle and provided a big win for Russia. According to Isaacson's book, Musk claimed that he took the action to save lives and because he was concerned that Russia would respond with a nuclear attack, a threat that is often made by Russian state media and propagandists, and of course, quite frequently by Vladimir Putin himself. But don't take a biographer's word for it. 2 weeks ago, September 7th, Musk posted his own explanation on X, the new name for Twitter. There was an emergency request from government authorities to activate Starlink all the way to Sevastopol in Crimea. The obvious intent being to sink most of the Russian fleet at anchor. If I had agreed to their request, then SpaceX would be explicitly complicit in a major act of war and conflict escalation. According to Musk, then, it was not his decision to turn off Starlink, but his refusal to activate Starlink. Is there a difference? Musk explained he was only following U.S. policy. If I had agreed to the request, then SpaceX would be explicitly complicit, and I guess I said, in major acts of war and conflict escalation. So he turned it off, or he refused to turn it on. Either way, it gets to the point, doesn't it? When a billionaire private citizen gets to decide which battles may or may not be fought in the course of an international conflict, naturally his first thought is not the rights and wrongs of war, but how it will affect his business holdings, in this case, SpaceX. And he's absolutely right to do so. His responsibility is to his shareholders, principal among whom, of course, is Elon Musk. It's not his job to wave a magic wand over terrestrial battlefields. And yet, that is exactly what he did. Whose fault is this? Not Musk's, not really. The fault lies with some collective decision in the past to privatize the waging of war by outsourcing its logistics to billionaires. You could call it the mercenarization of war. Not that Musk himself is a mercenary, certainly not. He is selling internet services and honorable trade. But when a single man, a citizen of neither warring side, can determine from afar the outcome of a military operation, well, what is war coming to? Down here on Earth, delegations from about 30 countries gathered last month in Saudi Arabia seeking a path toward peace in Ukraine. In Saudi Arabia? What do the Saudis have to do with Ukraine? Well, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky convened the meeting. His aim was to gain support in the so-called global south. That is, important countries that are not part of the wealthy Western world. Countries like India and Brazil, Indonesia, Egypt, Mexico, which have stayed neutral, not wanting to alienate the US or Russia or China. So many players in a land so distant from the battlefield. Russia was conspicuously not invited to the meeting, but Jake Sullivan, President Biden's national security advisor, was there, and so was a Chinese diplomat who had served recently as ambassador to Russia. China wants to see if Zelensky is succeeding in wooing the neutrals of the global south. The Chinese Foreign Affairs Ministry said afterward that the Saudi event further consolidated international consensus. It did not elaborate on what the consensus was, and the central problem for all the peace talk ventures is exactly that in reality there is no consensus. Nevertheless, China is crucial, for good or ill, on whatever happens in the war in Ukraine. Its presence in Saudi Arabia shows, according to Victor Gao, a prominent Chinese political analyst with strong links to the ruling party, that China supports substantive efforts to end the war through negotiation and diplomacy. China will listen carefully to any idea or proposal that is helpful to the peaceful settlement of the war. Well, this may be more than pious diplomat speak. Just before Russia invaded Ukraine last year, Moscow and Beijing announced a partnership with no limits. Once the war started, there were some limits. China has not sent Russia any lethal weapons, but it does buy Russian oil, partially making up for the loss of European markets, and it supplied various Chinese technologies to Russia. China sees the Russian alliance as a bulwark against US influence, and it sees the war as a sinkhole for America's military arsenal, and thus a diversion of US weapons and attention from Asia-Pacific region. But support for Russia may harm China's image in Europe, where its trade ties are extensive. So its interest in an eventual peace may not be entirely posturing. Indeed, many and divers are the proponents of peace. Is it possible that Vladimir Putin is joining their ranks? One way to gauge the progress of a war is to notice which side is ready for peace negotiations. For all the punditry about the sputtering progress of Ukraine's spring counteroffensive, Russia, it seems, at least for now, to be the more anxious about the war's prospects. Its propaganda is designed to appeal to dovish peaceniks. In aggrieved tones, it laments that the US and/or NATO and/or the West do not care how many Ukrainians are slaughtered in the present war, special military operation, whereas Russia seeks a more civilized outcome. Is it possible that Putin or his generals want to freeze the battle lines right now before Ukraine liberates any more of the territory that the Russian army seized at the beginning of the war? Two factors will play into Putin's willingness to negotiate. Can Russia's armed forces hold on to their gains or possibly make new ones? And second, the next year's United States presidential election. As we know, when Republicans control the White House, Democrats tend to turn dovish, and contrariwise, during Democratic administrations, Republicans find fault with American military conduct. This is actually a good thing in ordinary times. The function of an opposition is to oppose. It challenges the government to answer difficult questions. But I must say about the developing Republican opposition to the Iraq War, future president, he hopes, Donald Trump, has a plan to end the war in one day. So he says. And apparently this plan is to tell President Zelensky that all American aid is ended forthwith and hereby. That will drive Zelensky into the arms of Putin and end the war. Other GOP figures, arguably more thoughtful, question whether Ukraine is truly a strategic interest of the United States. Should we not pivot to Asia, bolster our allies there, and confront Chinese expansionist aims? And then there's Congressman Matt Gaetz of Florida. Why would you pick Ukraine for NATO membership? Asks Gaetz. Why not extend NATO to Russia and make it an anti-China alliance? If we had to pick Russia or Ukraine for NATO, one could reasonably make the argument that Russia probably provides more benefit long term. The notion that the West can pull Russia into an anti-China alliance is so patently ludicrous that you can't imagine Gaetz actually believes it. Historically, Russia, and particularly Putin's Russia, needs to be feared. Would never agree to join an alliance like NATO as a junior partner, overshadowed by pretty much everyone else. And the West would work to constrain Russia's imperialist ambitions. At least with China, Russia can pretend to be an equal partner, and China is happy to play along, and neither one will contain the other's imperial expansionist agenda. And then there's Trump's ridiculous assertion that China wants large portions of unpopulated land to have for their much larger population. This actually was a Russian obsession 50 years ago when I worked in Moscow. This is after Nixon and Kissinger's opening to China to take advantage of the mutual antagonism between the two communist behemoths. I knew opinion leaders in Moscow who fantasized darkly about China's teeming millions pouring over the Siberian border seeking Lebensraum, loaded word, in an empty Siberian land. That was then. Now China's population is shrinking. Its birth rate is nearly the lowest in the world. China's problem isn't a lack of space for its people. It has a landmass 3 times larger than India's, which is now the most populous country in the world. China's immediate problem is economic stagnation, but that's a separate matter. China's strategic goal is to reorient the world away from the dominance, economic and political, of the United States and the Western powers. That is the rationale for the No Limits alliance with Russia and the wooing of the global South, and especially authoritarian, non-democratic countries. That is why China and Russia boycotted the recent G20 meeting in India, of the world's richest countries. The message, we, that is China and Russia, are no longer of your world. We no longer accept domination by Western-oriented global structures. However, the absence of these two powers, China and Russia, did not result in a strongly worded communique from the G20 condemning Russia's aggression or supporting Ukraine. Too many countries are taking a wait-and-see attitude, including some European countries. Is it possible? Well, Europeans are showing some war fatigue. Ukraine's summer counteroffensive has been making slow progress at best. The West's sanctions against commercial dealing with Russia are burdening European countries more than they are the US. There is the maxim, where you stand depends on where you sit. Some Europeans live closer to Europe than other Europeans. This proximity, or lack of it, naturally shapes viewpoints. Finally, Europeans and Vladimir Putin are listening to what Republicans are saying about the war and thinking ahead to next year's presidential election. Here are the opening paragraphs of an article in the current Atlantic magazine. The author is Philip Payson O'Brien. He's professor of strategic studies at the University of St Andrews in Scotland. He writes, Europe and the United States are on the verge of the most momentous, conscious uncoupling in international relations in decades. Since 1949, NATO has been the one constant in world security, initially an alliance among the United States, Canada, and 10 countries in Western Europe. NATO won the Cold War and has since expanded to include almost all of Europe. It has been the single most successful security grouping in modern global history. It also might collapse by 2025, 2 years from now. It also might collapse by 2025. The cause of this collapse would be the profound difference in outlook between the Republican Party's populist wing, which is led by Donald Trump, but now clearly makes up the majority of the GOP, and the existential security concerns of much of Europe. The immediate catalyst for the collapse would be the war in Ukraine. When the dominant faction within one of the two major American political parties can't see the point in helping a democracy-minded country fight off Russian invaders, that suggests that the center of the political spectrum has shifted in ways that will render the US a less reliable ally to Europe. The latter, that is the Europeans, should prepare accordingly. And that is also why, if the United States values stability in Europe, it cannot pivot to China without defeating Russia first. Defeating Russia does not mean occupying Moscow. It does not mean overthrowing Putin. It does not necessarily mean even restoring to Ukraine every square inch of territory occupied by Russia. It does mean making it abundantly clear to the world and to Putin, first of all, that he has lost and has no way to recover or regain face. Anything less just buys him time. Take the Korean War solution, sometimes put forward as a model for resolving the Ukrainian conflict. Declare an armistice to stop the killing. Freeze the armies in their present positions, and then negotiate later when conditions are ripe. 70 years later, you could argue that in Korea, even though conditions never ripened for serious negotiations, this solution perhaps was the best outcome of the Korean War, except for the 25 million immiserated North Koreans. For Ukraine, however, the Korean solution leaves Putin in possession of about 20% of Ukraine's internationally recognized borders. How can European countries that live close to Russia, that were constituents of the Russian Empire in bygone times, or the Soviet Union in Cold War times, those that lost chunks of their territory to Russia after World War II, there they are on the map: Finland, the Baltic nations, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, Bulgaria, Romania, Poland, Czechia. How can these former dependents understand a freeze in place as anything other than a form of perma-war, in which a revanchist Russia would have established its ability to seize chunks of the land of its neighbors, as it did in Chechnya, 2000, Moldova, 2006, Georgia, 2008, Crimea, 2014, and so on. Russia can now bide its time with the freeze in place, rebuilding its army until conditions turn favorable again. Poland, in particular, is beefing up its military capability because it fears exactly this. I saw one perhaps cheerleading analysis that ended with a prediction that by 2025, Poland will have the second most powerful army in Europe. Which is the first, by the way? Britain or France are nuclear powers. Germany's got a better industrial base. Anyway, Poland will be right up there with them. Oh, and then there are the mature NATO members: Germany, France, Britain, Italy, and others. Their lands are more distant from Putin's Russia, and their governments are more accustomed to dealing with it, negotiating with it, buying from it, selling to it. Face it, say France's current and former presidents, Emmanuel Macron and Nicolas Sarkozy. Though they are of opposite parties, their message is similar. Face it, Russia is not going away. We will be dealing with Russia for many decades, perhaps centuries. keep that in mind as we strategize possible war outcomes. And look at the United States, the de facto leader of the so-called free world. Next year is an election year. What do polls show about support for Ukraine? A poll conducted last month for CNN found that most Americans, 55%, oppose Congress authorizing additional funding to support Ukraine in its war with Russia. 51% say the U.S. has already done enough to help Ukraine. Just 48% say it should do more. Of course, a political party breakdown would show more Democrats in favor of supporting Ukraine, more Republicans opposed. Still, 51% of the whole believe we have done enough. 54% say no more funding. Should American support for Ukraine wither next year, either because a Republican wins the presidency, or even if President Biden is reelected with a divided Congress, there is no way European governments, themselves divided, can maintain the support, armed and politically, that has sustained Ukraine to this point. This is why Philip Payson O'Brien, whom I quoted a few paragraphs ago, fears that, in his words, Europe and the United States are on the verge of the most momentous, conscious uncoupling in international relations in decades. O'Brien does not mention, because it had not yet happened when he wrote his article, rising tension involving Ukraine and some of its NATO member supporters. Bulgarian nationalists marched this week demanding that the government resign and that Bulgaria quit NATO and stop supporting Ukraine. How numerous are these nationalists? I don't know, but Bulgaria is not the most stable government. It has had 5 elections in 2 years. So people march in the streets. So what? Then there's the case of Poland. Poland really wants Russia to lose the war, given Russia's centuries-long habit of helping itself to chunks of Poland now and then. Poland spent the entire 19th century absent from the map, carved up among the Russian and 2 other empires, Prussia and Austria. And arguably no European nation has given more to the Ukrainian cause. Poland welcomed 2 million refugees from Ukraine in the war's first weeks. Millions of Polish people have helped with housing or other volunteer support. And Poland has been among the leading suppliers of weaponry to the Ukrainian side until now. Now it says that it will no longer send weapons to Ukraine. Why? Wheat embargo. Once in the glory days of the Russian Empire, Ukraine was known as the breadbasket of Europe. Not for nothing is the Ukrainian flag a stripe of blue sky over a yellow stripe of abundant grain. Early in the war, the European Union, mindful of its many farmers whose income might be undercut by cheaper Ukrainian grain, decided not to import any grain from Ukraine. Now, as the tides of battle ebb and flow, some bureaucrat bozos in Belgium have decided to aid our plucky Ukrainian allies by buying their grain. Not so fast, says Poland. We stand up for our farmers. No, we've not cut off military aid to Ukraine. Instead, we're just building up Polish military strength against potential aggression. Oh my. War is not like checkers or chess. If only it were. Red wins or black, depending on a single participant's skill, and then it's all over. The whole strategy is on the game board. So simple. No Polish farmers, no French sophisticates. When I began collecting material for this presentation, my working title was Putin After Prigozhin. As you see, I said little about Putin and nothing at all about Yevgeny Prigozhin, the mercenary chief who led a brief rebellion in June and then perished in a plane crash last month. It is still worth talking at least briefly about what the Prigozhin affair means for Putin's dictatorial hold on Russia, and what it means for Prigozhin's mercenary group, Wagner, and for the future of what we might call mercenarism. First, Putin. Media pundits want to know, is his position strengthened or weakened in the aftermath of Prigozhin's demise? Or is it possible that on the citizen level, no one cares? Last month, Russia's first feature-length film about the Ukraine war premiered. The Witness is its title, the story. A renowned Belgian violinist, Daniel Cohen, arrives in Kiev to perform in February 2022, just days before Russian troops entered Ukraine. Cohen gets caught up in events, witnessing a series of inhuman crimes and bloody provocations by Ukrainian nationalists. At one point, a Ukrainian commander is seen walking around carrying a copy of Mein Kampf, while other soldiers pledge their allegiance to Adolf Hitler. As witness to these unspeakable horrors, Cohen sets out to tell the world the truth about the conflict. But The Witness is a box office flop. In its first 2 weeks, according to the British Guardian newspaper, it grossed about 7% of its production cost. Viewers across the country reported empty cinema halls. At least Putin has one booster. North Korea's leader Kim Jong-un trundled in his armored train, top speed said to be 25 miles an hour, up to Vostochny, Russia's spaceport in the country's far east, north of Vladivostok and not far from China's Manchurian border. And there he met Vladimir Putin for a love fest and a business meeting. Putin welcomed his dear friend and noted that it was the Soviet Union that first recognized the independence of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea in 1948. Kim was even more effusive in his praise of his host. Russia is now rising to the sacred struggle to defend its state sovereignty, he said. So that's what this war is about, a sacred struggle to defend Russia's sovereignty and its very existence. It's striking that this meeting took place in a space launch facility. What Russia wants from North Korea is bullets, well, and artillery shells, things to fire at the Ukrainian army because it's used up an awful lot so far. Ammunition, much of it rather vintage, manufactured to fit yesteryear's ordnance, and that's what Russia largely has now, yesteryear's ordnance. After 19 months of sacrificing modern equipment and battering away at Ukrainian defenses. And North Korea also has vast stockpiles of outdated ammunition, acquired from the Soviet Union several decades ago, the first time the two countries were friends. In return, North Korea wants food aid. For at least 25 years, much of the North Korean population has been malnourished. So food aid and also space technology. Last May, North Korea tried and failed to put a satellite in orbit, ostensibly for surveillance, to keep an eye on enemy military activities. For enemy, read South Korea and the US. We have here classic capitalism. We are bringing buyer and seller together for the benefit of both. Food for bullets. So President Putin has one booster and elsewhere one mocker. The mockery occurred at a reception in Slovenia, honoring the Albanian foreign minister. Slovenia, Albania. How many countries have I mentioned now? Some of the countries you've never heard of, or hardly. Maybe Slovenia and Albania are distant enough from the Kremlin that it is safe to joke about Putin. Luckily for us here today, Wallingford is also pretty far from Moscow. So here goes, the joke. Feel free to laugh. Russian Prime Minister comes to Putin with a plea. The country's 9 time zones need to be unified. Yes, 9 time zones. Russia really does stretch from about the longitude of Athens, past all of Asia, past Japan to Alaska, 9 time zones. And the Prime Minister continues with his plea to President Putin. I called my family on vacation to wish them good night. And they said, no, it's morning, we're on the beach. I called Olaf Scholz, the German Prime Minister, to wish him a happy anniversary. He said, no, that's tomorrow. I called Xi Jinping to wish him a happy new year. He says, it's still the old year. Putin sighs sympathetically. Oh, geez, I know all about it. Same thing happened to me. I called Prigozhin's family to tell them how I was saddened by their loss. Turned out the plane hadn't even taken off yet. Dictators really don't like to be ridiculed. All right, so much for Putin after Prigozhin. How about Prigozhin after Putin? Can anyone replace the brutal, charismatic mercenary leader? Oh, hell yes. Prigozhin was the evil genius who created the template for mercenary activities. At least a dozen private mercenary companies already exist. They will have studied the Prigozhin model, taken note of its delightfully lucrative possibilities, and are scheming to get into the game. First, though, who gets to take over Prigozhin's operation? A going concern offering paramilitary and propaganda services. The Russian government seems to have the inside track. It was always Prigozhin's silent partner. The way it worked, Prigozhin studied the globe and identified, often in Africa, a country with abundant natural resources, political rivalries, perhaps lingering colonial resentments. He presented a plan to Putin for approval. Then, with Putin's tacit blessing, he approached the dictator, the target country, or occasionally a potential putschist outsider. Prigozhin's Wagner force would provide security to the leader, and its propaganda arm would flood the internet with scurrility toward its enemies. As we know, Prigozhin's troll farms in America's 2016 election generated a drumbeat of slander against Hillary Clinton. "We can do that for you too," was Prigozhin's message to African leaders. "All we ask in return is access to your resources, gold, diamonds, lumber, whatever, and for you to cut ties with European and Western countries and offer diplomatic support for Russia." According to Vladimir Putin's almost certainly inflated figure, these agreements enriched Prigozhin by $4 billion in Putin's words, gold and bling, diamonds. And of course, Putin himself and others along the way got their cut too. Who wouldn't want to take over an operation like that? There's a strong market in Africa's weaker countries for regime protections. Russia's deputy defense minister, Yunusbek Yevkurov, has been making the rounds. In Burkina Faso, he met Captain Ibrahim Traoré, who took power in a coup last year and severed long-standing ties with France. At a Russia-Africa summit this summer in St. Petersburg, Traoré said, "Russia is part of Africa's family." In Libya, Yevkurov explained to the strongman Khalifa Haftar that Wagner's fighters would stay on, but Russian military intelligence would now be in charge. And he presented El Haftar with a ceremonial pistol. All very well, but will Wagner's fighters stay on? Under the flamboyant Prigozhin, Wagner had an esprit de corps lacking in the regular army. Wagner is not just about the money, said Maxime Chigalet, a close Prigozhin confidant. It's kind of a religion. That was the spirit that Prigozhin cultivated with his scathing criticism of the Russian army as ill-commanded and cowardly, a word he used for some individual commanders, cowardly. Wagner's hard-fought victory at Bakhmut last spring was the only notable Russian triumph after the opening days of the war. Will Wagner fighters schooled in contempt for the Moscow-led forces easily cross over? Some are saying that Prigozhin's son, Pavel Prigozhin, should take over. Well, even if he does, he will need Putin's blessing. What these governments are buying is not only militia services, but also Moscow's backing. So what do we make of the report, just a couple of days ago, that Ukrainian special services attacked a Wagner group in Sudan? In Sudan? Well, there's a civil war there, but shouldn't Ukrainians be fighting in Ukraine rather than picking sides in Sudan's war? Maybe one day it'll make sense. But however the Wagner situation shakes out, the mercenaries of the world have taken in the Wagner business model. A dozen private companies already exist to compete for paramilitary contracts. Post-Ukraine, it's a mercenary world. We really can't conclude without some assessment of the war on the ground. After a summer of apparent stalemate in the ballyhooed Ukrainian springtime counteroffensive, it seems that finally there is some positive news. There's a military cliche that I didn't know. shaping the battlefield. This goes back to the Chinese sage Sun Tzu, who lived, well, nobody's quite sure, but perhaps 2,500 years ago. His classic treatise, The Art of War, is still taught at West Point and other citadels of military knowledge, apparently including Ukraine. A quote from Sun Tzu: "One must know not only the resources of the opponent, but also, more importantly, the minds, thought processes, and wills of its leaders." Well, Ukraine has a lot of experience with Russia and probably does know quite a bit about the minds, thought processes, and wills of the leaders. But one way of looking at the summer battle, which was called stalled for most of the summer, is that they weren't really trying to take much ground back. What they were trying to do was to degrade the Russian army by attacking its logistics. Supplies, roads, rails, and so forth. Ukraine's armed forces, hopelessly outnumbered as it would seem, have gained a lot of credit for understanding its enemy, Russia, and attacking its weak points. Especially it's focused on degrading the logistics, transportation hubs, ammunition depots, roads and rails. And now, just this last week or two, it does seem to be gaining ground. There's a headline this morning about breaking through, not with a few troops, but with tanks rolling now through breaches in the Russian defense line. Remember Bakhmut, the famous victory of Prigozhin's mercenaries that I reported about last spring? Well, Prigozhin is gone and Wagner's fighters left Bakhmut. But it seems that this week Ukrainian forces are in the process of winning Bakhmut back. Why? The entire town was already a parking lot of rubble, and it never had much strategic significance anyway. Apparently, the importance of Bakhmut is that it's a marker of who's on top. Well, then, bully for Ukraine, take it back. But that was not all. Last week, Ukrainian forces attacked a naval dry dock in the Russian-controlled Crimean port of Sevastopol and damaged, or perhaps even destroyed, a submarine and a surface ship. And just a day or two ago, Ukrainian fire hit the headquarters of Russia's Black Sea Fleet in Crimea. Ukraine claims, this is again a headline from this morning, they claim that among dozens of killed and wounded at that headquarters were several senior leaders of the Russian Black Sea Fleet. The Black Sea is no longer a Russian lake. Still, we can't leave it there. Biden's UN speech was interesting in that it abandoned the language of democracies versus autocracies. There may not be enough real democracies. For example, India's democracy has become kind of unsavory, but the US and India can find common interests, for example, in resisting Chinese encroachments. Well, let's not get ahead of ourselves now. Do you remember fairly recently there was going to be a new world order? The Arab Spring a dozen years ago? Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, Syria, and so on. Uprisings there showed that the people were establishing a new world order of democratic polities. Well, all those countries are now under authoritarian leaders again, different ones than before, but still authoritarian. So let's not get ahead of ourselves about this new world order. Still, here are some data points. The International Monetary Fund estimates that 70% of the world's growth this year will come from Asia, not Europe, not the United States. 40 countries have joined the regime of sanctions against Russia for its aggression against Ukraine, but 2/3 of the world's population lives in countries that do not accept the sanctions. Well, China and India, of course, are a long way toward that 2/3. They're sitting it out, making no moral judgments. For them, this is a European war in which they have no stake, though they suffer its consequences in terms of food and energy insecurity. Remember the bipolar world of last century? Of course we do. Communism versus capitalism, Cold War. Then there was the third world, a battleground of competition between the two main forces. With us or against us? That dichotomy no longer prevails in today's world. Allegiances are multiple. India is a member of BRICS, the grouping of Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, BRICS, BRICS, and also of the US-led Quad, India, US, Japan, Australia, a group to check China. These are Pacific powers, or Pacific or Indian Ocean. Saudi Arabia will join BRICS, and is also talking with the US about a security partnership and about diplomatic relations with Israel. Turkey is a NATO member that maintains good relations with Russia. And the United States announced last week a partnership with Vietnam. At the United Nations meeting this week, the leaders of China and Russia were absent. This gave President Biden the opportunity to convene a meeting with the CA5. Who? CA5, Central Asia, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan. All are former Soviet republics, now nominally independent, but still in the Russian orbit. And all of them are willing to publicly sit down and have a meeting with Biden. Dare we say that the world is reconfiguring before our eyes? And that the Ukrainian war is not a cause, but certainly an accelerator. The global turmoil has tossed up a key choice for Americans. How engaged or how withdrawn shall we be? How entangled? How aloof? This will be an unwritten question on next year's ballots. Many years ago, in another time of baffling change, the French philosophe Voltaire wrote a novel that put his protagonist Candide through an exhausting series of adventures and upheavals and disasters. Was this indeed, as Candide's teacher insisted, the best of all possible worlds? Candide finally decided that pretty obviously it was not the best of all possible worlds. What then? Candide's solution: we must cultivate our garden. We'll build a sweet little nest somewhere in the west and let the rest of the world go by. That choice may not be available to us. The world is too much with us, late and soon. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hal. And now I'm going to hand the microphone to Laureen for...
Is it on?
Could we have a musical encore?
Questions, comments?
Could we have a musical encore?
I think Bob's hand went up first.
Oh, there it is, yeah.
Hal, based on your analysis, what is it that autocrats know about the democracies that we're missing?
Well, they know we have division, we have differences of opinion, and that slows things down, and they're efficient and can get things done until, like Putin, he takes advice from only people who want to curry favor with him, and he does a dumb thing like go and invade Ukraine. It may cost him his seat, but it certainly is costing him a lot of money and prestige. So, yes, they are more efficient until they're not anymore. Well, the American democracy isn't very efficient at the moment either. That's another story. Yes?
Could you provide insight into the dismissal of Ukrainian generals for corruption?
That was something I was talking about with Jerry last night, and told him I would get it into the, but I didn't, so I'm glad you asked. No, I can't provide much insight, but Ukraine has been a country with a corrupt government. It is a descendant of the Soviet Union, which had a corrupt government. And with the war, you would hope that Ukrainians would pull together in patriotic ardor, but old habits die hard. And yeah, the defense minister was dismissed this week, and a couple of generals have been sacked. And this is apparently what it is what, corruption and payoffs? How can you do that if you're a defense minister and a patriotic general leading an army that is outperformed? Well, I still ought to get my cut, right? Yeah. So.
Jerry.
So what Macron says is certainly true. Well, one will have to live with Russia one way or another. And the question is, What way? Typically, when we have been engaged in war, we required unconditional surrender. That's unlikely to be the case with regard to anything that comes about in the Soviet Union.
Very unlikely.
Very unlikely. So what does one see the future role of the Soviet Union as? And if you have some insight as to how do they see it themselves?
How do the Russian? How do Macron?
No,
what
how
ideas
does
do they
Macron
have,
see it, and how do the Russians see it?
Or how do the Russians see it? Yeah. Well, there are apparently some channels in what you might call the dark internet in Russia that are broadcasting candid reports of one kind or another, or Radio Liberty seems to the U.S. Subsidiary of Radio Free Europe. The Radio Liberty was broadcasting a report about, stories about misery on the front lines, that Russian soldiers are saying. Well, the news gets back to mothers, and I guess Putin's idea is to try to keep it silent. There's nothing about this, of course, in the government-controlled channels. One thing, apparently the last mobilization was they went to non-Russian parts of Russia to sign up, the people from various Siberian ethnicities that got swept into the empire 150 years ago, and send them, because that of course it still has to be. I mean, there are far more Russians than there are of anything else in Russia, but these are ways, I guess, that he's trying to keep the bad news from coming out. But of course, it does come out, and I think Putin's end game probably is simply to hope the Republicans win next year, cut off the aid, and and just wait the Ukrainians out. They're dying too, a lot of them, and I don't know what else. I don't know what he would be willing to agree to, other than, as you say, unconditional surrender on the Ukrainian side.
Which won't happen either.
From our media, we get the idea that most of the Russian population is sort of in the pocket of Putin, despite the dark internet and whatever.
Yeah, well, they're indifferent. This is a long history, and it's true in many dictatorships that if you're mean enough and you convince people there's nothing you can do about it anyway, then and they're smart. They aren't audacious enough to tell pollsters, "I'm against Putin." Of course not. That's a one-way ticket to trouble. So it's really kind of hard to measure public support. But back in the Soviet Union 50 years ago, most people would just shrug their shoulders and say, life's getting a little better. I'm fine with them, but they really weren't. It was simply that they thought this is the best of all possible worlds. If it mean possible, Stalin's gone anyway. So Putin counts on that, of course, the fact that there is no alternative, and so why stick your neck out?
I'm just thinking, and my question may not be answerable, but I appreciate having your thoughts. In trying to make sense of international relations, we have the autocrats and we have the democracies. But we've got something new in the Prigozhins and the Musks.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Sort of the capitalist system, the oligarchs and the zillionaires. And how important is that a factor in trying to make sense of international relations, this new element, if it's a new element?
Yeah, well, that's so I tried to highlight both of those things. The fact that Prigozhin is gone, but don't think that the mercenaries are gone. If anything, this is just going to encourage them. You know, we had, should we call them mercenaries? You know, we had Blackwater in Iraq. You know, there was the idea that we were hiring private companies to provide security and that sort of thing. Well, is that such a bad thing? You know, banks hire private security companies to, you know, well, no, it's not a bad thing until it becomes a bad thing. You know, which is pretty quick apparently in wartime. So yes, I think you're right. You know, that's why I highlighted both Musk and the future of mercenaries. Oh, you know, there have been mercenaries in Africa and elsewhere for a long time, colonial times, and during decolonization. But we have better global communication and transportation now, I guess. So they have a wider reach. You know, there was one of those, Mad Mike Hoare was one of the H-O-A-R-E. Was one of the mercenaries back in the 1960s and 70s, a swashbuckling British figure, you know, then in Africa. But it's been industrialized. There are individuals now.
Henry is next.
No, third.
Oh.
If real estate is no longer the major issue, what are the major goals of Ukraine and what are the major goals of Russia?
Well, Ukraine is to secure its independence and to get back the land it's lost.
Yeah, but how does it do that?
Well, how does it do that? By outlasting Russia. Well, how does it do that? By hoping, I guess, that the United States and other countries will keep the aid coming. Ukraine's army now is much better equipped than Russia's is. Russia's advantage now mainly is in manpower. But it is, there are some, you know, I've seen statistics. Russia is now increasing its production of artillery shells to 2 million shells a month. Yeah, but it's burning 6,000 or 8,000 shells a month, 6 or 8 million shells a month. Gosh, what a barrage that must be in Ukraine. So, yeah, how does Ukraine win the war under those circumstances? This, of course, is why they have to go to North Korea now to get their artillery. How does Russia achieve its ends? Well, it has to have something it can call a victory. You know, I don't think it can any longer expect just to take over Ukraine. I think it's too late for that. But it has to have something that Putin can call face-saving. Maybe, you know, some have said, particularly at the beginning of the war, some people said, why not accept the independence of the Donetsk and the other one. They're two little places little enclaves in Ukraine that actually probably had more Russians than Ukrainians in them in the first place, and certainly would now. A lot of the Ukrainians have left. Why not just give it to them? Well, that's a victory. Well, yes, Putin would say so, and maybe that would make him stop. But I think this was something people talked about a year ago, but they don't talk about it as much now because, you know, they just think that Ukraine deserves a better outcome than have some of its territory just hand it over.
Henry, oh no? Okay.
I was pointing at errors.
Jerry.
I'm afraid I'm going to push you harder.
Oh.
So the question is Macron's view that he's going to take putting up with Russia because we have to live with them in the same sense that we feel like we have to live with the Republicans.
It's a good analogy. You know, I had a thought. Is is the support for Ukraine going to be at all affected if we have what seems to be likely a government shutdown? Or whether the mechanics of our government, oh, I don't know, that's pretty technical.
I think just a week or so ago, I don't know if it was the White House or the Pentagon, said that Pentagon spending would not be affected by the shutdown. Okay, so in that case, no, I guess they can keep it going. At least for how long?
Eric.
I mean, that, of course, is going to be appealed somehow. You wait a minute. Pentagon gets to spend money without approval authorization by Congress? So it'll be in the courts. Yeah,
has the bridge to Georgia been destroyed, or is it still there?
To Crimea? Yeah, it's still there. It has been, there's traffic on it. I don't know whether the traffic is flowing at a regular speed or not, but it's certainly been damaged. And one of the things they're trying to do now in the south of Ukraine is just cut the roads. There's a sort of a land bridge from Russia to Crimea in addition to the sea bridge. And the apparent strategy has been, of the counteroffensive, has been to see if they can cut that land bridge. And if you can, then I guess after that, maybe you attack the architectural bridge over the sea.
Well, that bridge over the water from Georgia to Ukraine would seem to be a major target and quite vulnerable.
Yeah.
Is that not true?
You mean from Crimea, I think, not Georgia.
Well, it starts in Georgia, I believe, and ends up in Crimea.
No, I don't think. No, I think it's yeah. Anyway, as far as I believe, from the last I've heard, that bridge is still functional. It was never entirely knocked out. It was for a couple of weeks, I think. They couldn't run trains there, but there was some truck traffic, and I think it may have been restored now. But of course, the Russians know how vulnerable it is. I mean, if you can bomb it once, you can bomb it another time.
Is that it? Everyone had?
Thank you so much, Hal.
And I also want to thank Carrie. She's the one who got all the pictures together. She went on the internet and found them, so that was the hard part.